All right, so second part of our chapter 28, the affluent society, is going to shift gears a little bit, talking less about the affluence and material growth or poverty of the 1950s, and instead talk a little bit about the beginning of the civil rights movement. Okay, so the civil rights movement has its roots in some of the things that started during the 1940s, efforts of people like A. Philip Randolph, or even Harry Truman and others that have really tried to push civil rights ideas out more effectively around the country, were being kind of devised during this time and pursued. You got to understand the context of things a little bit now. After the big shift, the party shift during Roosevelt's presidency, there were all these Southern Democrats that were kind of left without a party, and these people became known as Dixiecrats. One of the uh, basis ideas of Dixiecrats was what you'd call um, quite a bit of a lack of sympathy towards racial issues in the civil rights movement. And this is going to be an impetus for a lot of the big events that are going to come beginning in the 1950s, where all this groundwork is laid for the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Kind of the seminal moment, the early big moment of the civil rights movement comes with the death of Emmett Till in 1954. Emmett Till was a kid that went into a school in I'm sorry, not a school. He went into a shop in the South and hollered at a white girl. Some black men overheard this, or I'm sorry, some white men overheard this and didn't like the idea of a black man talking to a white girl, so they took him, tied him to the back of their car, brutally beat him, killed him, and then dumped him in the car in a swamp. Ultimately, men were arrested for it, but these guys got off of the crime without being, found guilty. Um, the civil rights movement comes out of this because when Emmett's body returned home to Chicago, his mother decided to have an open casket funeral so people could see the mutilation and brutality that happened to him, and the world can see how many really racial and civil rights issues are still very prevalent in the South during this time. Another watershed moment, of course, for the um, civil rights movement is the Brown versus Board of Education decision. 1954 decision, Brown versus Topeka, Kansas Board of Education, which says that separate but equal, the old Plessy versus Ferguson decision, separate but equal is actually inherently unequal and unfair. Basically, the case centered around originally, when cases make their way through the courts and ultimately to the Supreme Court, the nature of the case changes to be kind of a bigger issue. It started when a girl was denied the right to go to the school that was only like a block or so away from her home, instead having to go to the other side of Topeka, Kansas, to a all to an all black school that caused her, to have difficulty getting there every day, and it was a dangerous trip with several bus switches and whatnot. This was the impetus for the case that ultimately overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Brown decision, of course, is going to be a big deal, but of course, it's going to be received, very differently by different populations. This ultimately results in something that we call massive resistance. The concept of massive resistance is, essentially the idea that some people aren't going to be too thrilled about the new decision regarding uh, integration of schools. So you see in many cities around many cities and states in the South and places in certain areas of the country, there's a lot of resistance to the concept um, of integrating the schools. I think the most telling picture, it comes from the famous story in Little Rock, Arkansas, of the Little Rock Nine who integrated Central High School in Little Rock. I think this is just an incredible picture, and that you have Elizabeth Eckford, one of the 9 students that integrated Little Rock High School. But look at the faces of the hecklers and the angry mob of people, the women that Some of them are, I know they look like they're like grandmas, but some are actually students at school with her as well. They're just so angry about the concept of this black girl going to school with them. If you can see kind of the anger, on the faces of these women here, and how it's just that's how people felt, right? The governor of uh, the governor of Arkansas was there to try to uh, prevent these 9 African American students from going into this school. It took Dwight Eisenhower to kind of come in and with the National Guard and force them to say no. These kids are going into school. That's how bad the racial situation was in a lot of places in the South. And it took a lot of courage for these 9 students to say, we're going to be the guinea pigs that integrate the school and deal with the racial problems that we're going to experience. So a lot of credit should be due to the Little Rock Nine. And it's important to think of too how hard of a decision this was for Dwight D. Eisenhower. The president never wants to deploy our own troops on, on American people to help keep the peace through a form of like martial law or posse comitatus or something like that. So the idea of this happening at all was very disturbing for Eisenhower. He was reluctant to do this, but ultimately he had to do it to enforce the new law that had been created. So, where does the civil rights movement go from there? Well, it expands from obviously something that's a legal apparatus to something that has to involve other important people. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Rosa Parks. She was another seminal moment here, and of course Martin Luther King. Okay, so we're going to talk about these folks here in a second. One thing to understand about Rosa Parks, we all know her as the woman who wouldn't get up from the bus um, and give up her seat to a white man. Uh, there had been a policy in the Montgomery buses that forced African Americans to go sit in the back of the bus. So this wasn't a new law. It was perceived as a bad law, which of course it was. Rosa Parks was not just some innocent woman that was there to prevent or was there and just happened to be in a wrong place at the wrong time. She was actually an activist in Montgomery and a member of the various civil rights groups there. And she determined that I am going to do this thing to bring attention to this horrible uh, circumstance that we're all as African Americans living with in Montgomery. So, ultimately, she got arrested for not moving. She had to pay like a $5 fine, and that was it. But it brings attention to the racial injustices that exist in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. is also another really, obviously, a very important figure in the civil rights movement. Here's one thing to understand about Martin Luther King Jr., and if you've had society and culture, I've talked about this in that class. In order for the civil rights movement to be a success, it needs a voice that can attract people from around the country. And I'm not saying just black people, but white people as well. Martin Luther King Jr. stands out because he's an eloquent speaker. Okay, he's an eloquent speaker. He preaches nonviolent resistance, which is a powerful message. He's educated. He's very intelligent sounding, and he is. He's very eloquent and all that stuff. Essentially, for lack of a better term, he sounds like a white man. Okay, and because of that, white people in the North are more able to kind of gravitate towards or understand and respect the viewpoint that Martin Luther King is giving. Him and Martin Luther King and Winston Churchill are probably the two best speakers of the 20th century. And he's really, really important, Martin Luther King, to make the civil rights movement a success, right? And subsequently, the Montgomery bus boycotts, which continue to bring more attention to the movement. Who inspires all this? Where do all these ideas come from? Obviously, they come from Gandhi's efforts in India during the 1930s and 40s to bring to mind the oppression of the oppression that the British people are putting upon people of India. We use this movement in our country during our movement and look to have similar results. It's a powerful vision when you see peaceful protesters like we do during the 1950s in the South that are being pursued and hit by police with billy clubs and fire hoses and cattle prods or electrical things they used to keep horses or to keep horses and cows wrangled. Um, and when the people don't fight back physically, it creates in this country a sense of, um, certainly disdain for the people that are doing the crimes, so to speak, that are doing the attacking. And this is part of the big reason why we see in the 1950s, finally, the civil rights movement, long overdue, start to have some real success. On the other side of the passive nonviolent resistance approach that Martin Luther King supported was Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X, grew up as kind of a hood, kind of a hoodlum, and then joins with the Nation of Islam, eventually changing his name from Malcolm Little. Got rid of the L, or he got rid of Little and replaced it with X because Little is a slave name given to him and is not his real name. While Martin Luther King supported nonviolence, Malcolm X supported not so much violence, but kind of equal treatment. In other words, if a white man slaps you, Malcolm X would say you slap him back. You don't turn the other cheek, you slap him back. In other words, if Martin Luther King was the if Booker T. Washington was the Martin Luther King of his era, W.E.B. Du Bois would be the Malcolm X of his era. Okay, Malcolm X, he had a great following and gained more and more influence and significance over time, but ultimately kind of came around on the idea of nonviolence and started to say that the Martin Luther King Jr. Method was more successful and a better way to pursue civil rights opportunities. And then Malcolm X got gunned down and murdered in 1965, a few years before Dr. King. So we kind of went through some of the causes of the civil rights movement already and some of the major events, but some of the other factors that lead to the civil rights movement happening. Okay, for one, you have during the 1950s, a growing proportion of urban African American urban black middle class members. These are people that open stores in the storefronts being left by whites who go out to the suburbs with a little more money and a little more influence and a little more power, so to speak. They have more of a voice. They can affect public opinion. They can impact laws and the legal system in the towns in which they live. So we're seeing one big cause of the civil rights movement happening is you finally have a growing group of successful, educated African Americans which have more of a voice in terms of political decision making and things of that nature. The other big factor is, of course, white people. Okay, in order for the civil rights movement in the South to be successful, you obviously need these growing numbers of middle class urban blacks in the North to get mobilized and get behind the movement. But it's also important that whites support the movement. Why do you say? I know that sounds like kind of weird and horrible, but why is it so important? Why is it necessary that whites get behind the civil rights movement? Simply, folks, because they're the majority. If whites get behind a movement at this time in America, white America will listen, white America will follow, and white America will support if enough people believe it is the right direction to go. So the civil rights movement is aided not simply by the efforts of people like Martin Luther King Jr. in the South and Rosa Parks and Medgar Evers and other civil rights leaders, but it's actually because of the mobilization of both blacks and whites in the North to be supportive of civil rights objectives in the civil rights movement. So I don't want you to underestimate the importance of that in the process here of the civil rights movement. Okay. Again, I'm going to show you a picture here of Emmett Till in his casket. It's a little grainy, but it's kind of rough to look. So be ready for that. So this was Emmett Till's body as it laid um, there for everybody to see after his death during his funeral. You'd see his body's very mutilated and just a really horrible sight to see. But it is an image like that that helps get the civil rights movement started. We're going to stop there for today. One more set of notes for tomorrow. If you have questions about this stuff, please, please, please shoot me an email or we can discuss in our next Zoom meeting. All right, folks? Be well. Talk to you later.